the solutions needed to solve the big problems confronting Scotland and the world. And in both my view and in my experience, cooperation and collaboration in place of division and acrimony is what most people want to see much more of from their politicians. Of course, that spirit of cooperation and consensus building is also very much in keeping with the founding principles of our Scottish Parliament. Arguably, it has never been more important for us, all of us, to live up to these principles, and that is the motivation for reaching this agreement. It is not a full coalition. Our parties will retain distinct voices and independent identities, but it sets out processes of cooperation and consultation that will enable a firm foundation for the delivery of our shared and transformative policy objectives, and indeed for the Scottish Government's wider legislative and policy programme. As part of that, for the first time in UK politics, it will see Greens enter national government as ministers, working in a spirit of common endeavour, mutual challenge and collective responsibility to deliver for the people we serve. And to that end, I look forward later this afternoon to seeking Parliament's approval for the appointment of Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvie as Scottish ministers. An agreement like this is not something that would be seen as in any way remarkable or even unusual in other parts of Europe, but it does represent an important landmark for politics across the UK. Most importantly of all, however, this agreement provides a strong foundation, I hope, across the lifetime of this Parliament for bold and decisive action. After all, its ultimate test, as with any arrangement of this kind, isn't about how well the signatories get on, it's about what we deliver. There is, of course, and rightly so, a strong environmental theme to our shared policy agreement. We recognise the urgency of the climate and nature crisis and also the challenges inherent in tackling them. But we also appreciate that with the right approach and a commitment to climate justice, the transition to net zero will create economic opportunities and improve the well-being of all of us. We are determined to seize and realise those opportunities. Over the session of this Parliament, we will do more to decarbonise our transport network and support active travel. We will dedicate at least 10% of the Scottish Government's overall travel budget to active travel, cycling, walking and wheeling. We will significantly increase investment in public transport. We will work to cut the emissions from it and also to make it more accessible and affordable, with a commitment to free bus travel for young people, for example. And we will, of course, bring ScotRail into public ownership. All of these measures will help us by 2030 reduce car kilometres by 20%. Vital if we are to meet our climate targets, but also important to improving the environment in communities and neighbourhoods, the length and breadth of our country. We will also support the essential transformation in how we heat our homes and buildings. This term of Parliament will see investment of at least £1.8 billion in energy efficiency and renewable heating. We will do more too to protect our natural environment. We will designate a new national park, plant more trees, including more native species, and protect more of our seas. And we will work right across the economy to support a just transition to net zero, with just transition plans for all sectors and regions and a new green industrial strategy with investment in skills at its heart. As part of that, we will support and accelerate the necessary and inevitable transition from fossil fuels to renewable and low-carbon sources of energy. Through this agreement, we will deliver a stronger package of support for marine renewables and offshore wind, and significantly increase our onshore wind capacity. And we will also establish a 10-year, £500 million Just Transition Fund for the North East and Moray, to ensure that the jobs and communities dependent on our oil and gas sector are not left behind, and that we instead use the considerable infrastructure, skills and expertise of that sector to help drive and speed up the development of cleaner alternatives. Our agreement will also help make Scotland fairer as a country. It will tackle child poverty and deliver stronger rights for tenants, including an effective system of rent controls, so that housing in the rented sector is more affordable and more secure, especially for families and for young people. We will make the investment in this Parliament to support the delivery of 110,000 new affordable homes between now and 2032. And we will reform our public services, including through the establishment of a national care service, perhaps the biggest public sector reform that this Parliament will ever have undertaken. Improvements too in mental health and work to improve education and close the poverty-related attainment gap. And finally, as I indicated earlier, this agreement does confirm our intention to give people in Scotland the choice of independence. The mandate for that is undeniable. Between us, the SNP and the Greens won 72 of the 129 seats in this Parliament, and each one of us was elected on a clear commitment to an independence referendum. But just as the mandate is undeniable, the reason for a referendum is just as important. As we emerge from this pandemic, the kind of country and society that Scotland is now and becomes in future, and the decisions that will shape our society and economy and our place in the world must be determined democratically here in Scotland and not imposed upon us so often against our will by government at Westminster. Presiding Officer, the agreement we have reached offers a clear vision of the sort of country Scotland can become, a greener, fairer and, yes, independent nation. It also recognises and puts into practice an approach to politics that sees parties try to work together for the common good. I firmly believe that is what most people in Scotland want to see. I hope this agreement, as we move now to implement it, will demonstrate that when we step out of those comfort zones and when we embrace cooperation, we enhance our ability to deliver the ideas and the practical policies that can meet the scale of the challenges we face. Of course, this agreement is novel in terms of UK politics, but across Europe and in many countries around the world, arrangements like this are commonplace, and they are based firmly on the idea that cooperation, rather than confrontation, will lead to better outcomes for the people across our country. This Parliament has undoubtedly secured some significant achievements in the last 2 decades, and all parties can and should take credit for that fact. But there have also been times, especially in more recent years, and this is not unique to Scotland, when our politics has been toxic and polarised. And because of that, we have sometimes seemed collectively incapable of properly living up to the expectations of those we serve. And just as we can all and should all take some credit for our successes, we all must bear some responsibility for our shortcomings. And I believe we all have an obligation to make positive change. This agreement represents a renewed commitment from the Scottish Government to do so. While it is, at political level, an agreement between the SNP and the Greens, I hope, and I mean this sincerely, that over time it can and it will encourage greater cooperation between all parties in this Parliament. There are issues, including, perhaps especially, the Constitution, on which we disagree profoundly and passionately. That is, I suspect, unlikely to change. But even on these fundamental issues, perhaps we should all make an effort to disagree more civilly. But there are many other issues, Presiding Officer, especially as we recover from the pandemic and address the climate emergency, where I believe acres of common ground can be found if we are willing to find it, while still acknowledging and respecting our disagreements. So despite all of the risks inherent in any decision of 2 parties to cooperate more closely, and with a full appreciation of the compromise and the ups and downs that an agreement like this will entail, the SNP and the Greens are choosing to work together. We're doing that because we believe in a time of great challenge, a better, more collaborative politics is needed so that a better Scotland can be built. And we are resolving to spend the next 5 years working together to build it. As we do so, I make an open and sincere offer to work whenever and wherever possible with others across this chamber too, and I hope that offer will be accepted. Presiding Officer, this agreement is a milestone in this Parliament's progress. It sets out how the SNP and the Scottish Greens will work together as the Scottish Government. It demonstrates our commitment to a new and a better way of doing politics, and it does provide the strong platform needed to deliver the transformative policies that will build a greener, fairer country and make people's lives across Scotland better. For all these reasons, I enthusiastically commend it to the Chamber.
Thank you. The First Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 40 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Finally, the SNP Green Deal has done something for the environment. Because Nicola Sturgeon has just spent the last 15 minutes recycling the exact same speech she gave last week. The exact same speech that she used to try and convince everybody this coalition isn't actually a coalition. Now, I know Nicola Sturgeon lectures us all that she speaks at a higher level of intelligence than everyone else. But trying to claim that this is not a coalition, well, that is quite simply a joke, even by SNP standards. And this is a nationalist coalition with one overriding goal: separating Scotland from the United Kingdom. Yet again, a divisive referendum has come first, as it always does with this government. It's a simple fact that Nicola Sturgeon made this nationalist deal her priority over a programme for government, which should have been announced today, as it normally always is at the start of a term. And she made it a priority over a flimsy NHS recovery plan that was more of a PR pamphlet. Once again, the SNP have got their priorities all wrong. They've turned their backs on jobs, our economy, the oil and gas industry, and on car drivers. This isn't a deal for hard-working Scotland. This coalition will hammer everyone who works hard, everyone who runs a business, everyone who owns a vehicle. This is not a deal that works for Scotland. This is a deal that works for Nicola Sturgeon. She failed to get a majority, and this deal is a consequence of that. Absolutely right. This deal is one that nobody wanted, even the Greens. In Lorna Slater's own words, before a promotion was dangled in front of her, an SNP Green Deal would be, and I quote, a terrible idea. So let me ask the First Minister, when her Green colleagues say she has made, and again, this is a direct quote, a significant change of direction on her approach to oil and gas, how many of Scotland's 100,000 oil and gas jobs will be put at risk by this change of direction? And since Nicola Sturgeon is appointing ministers who don't believe in economic growth, will Nicola Sturgeon now admit her financial case for Scottish independence is based on harming Scottish businesses and cutting Scottish jobs?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, it seems that rising to the challenge of doing politics better or even vaguely competently is for the moment beyond Douglas Ross. But hopefully, as this Parliament progresses, that will change. I think in that barely coherent set of questions, I think Douglas Ross really misses the point. We face big challenges, and it is incumbent on all of us not to disregard our disagreements, but to work beyond our disagreements to find the areas where we can agree, work together for the good of those we represent. That is how we're going to proceed in this Parliament, certainly on the part of those of us on these benches. And I think other parties in this chamber, in response to that, have a choice. They can join with us, respect our disagreements, but try all of us collectively to work together, or push themselves more and more to the margins of Scottish politics, where they simply hurl insults from the sidelines. And before I come on to the two specific questions that Douglas Ross posed to me, let me say this. Not only is Douglas Ross's rhetoric, in my view, given the scale of the challenges we face and the responsibilities we all bear, deeply inappropriate, it is also deeply, deeply ironic. Right now across this country, there are shortages of food on our supermarket shelves. In England, at least at the moment, the health service has been told to ration blood tests because of a shortage of test tubes. Children are being told that there may be shortages leading to a lack of toys for Christmas, all because of Mr Ross's party's obsession with Brexit. Isn't it about time he took some responsibility and recognised the importance of coming together to try to address these challenges? Turning now to oil and gas, I recognise, and it's a responsibility I take extremely seriously, that we must meet the climate emergency. And yes, that does mean making a transition, and a rapid enough transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy in order to do that. But I don't want to see jobs lost in the North Sea. That is why at the heart of this agreement is a just transition deal of £500 million specifically for the North East, so that we can harness the skills, the infrastructure, the expertise of that sector and use it to drive the development of those alternatives. And here's a suggestion. Perhaps in the spirit of consensus and cooperation and collaboration, perhaps we might hear the UK Government agree to match the Scottish Government's commitment to a just transition deal for the North East and Moray. So let's hear some substance in place of Mr Ross's rhetoric. And finally, on the question of independence, Mr Ross and I fundamentally disagree on the future of Scotland. My vision of the future of Scotland is a prosperous, fair, green country. But I believe in democracy. I believe in the right of the Scottish people to decide their own future. That's the prospectus I put to the Scottish people in May. And as I said, between us, the SNP and the Greens won 72 of the 129 seats. So democracy demands that the Scottish people get the right to decide. And it's only a politician that fears the outcome of such a choice that would seek to block the right of the Scottish people to make it.
Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This coalition agreement, for that is what it is just formalising the agreement in the last Parliament, where Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP hammer our public services with cuts, and the Greens simply nod it through. Cut through the spin and the now typical boasts of historic moments. This is no new government. This is not a clean start. This is a deal that is more about the Constitution, not the climate. I am all for common ground being found and cooperation on issues that parties agree on. But this deal is not about delivering greater accountability and transparency in this Parliament. It's about the opposite. It's about greater control for Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, not cooperation. The Greens can't pretend to be in government and pretend to be in opposition at the same time. At this time of acute economic, public health and climate crises, Scotland needs a government focused on bringing our country together and addressing the urgent issues at hand. Unemployment, child poverty, drugs deaths, clearing the NHS backlog, the climate emergency. That's what faces and confronts our country. So does the First Minister understand that bringing our country together means more than just working with people that agree with you on the Constitution? Does she understand that our national recovery must truly be our collective national mission, and that it must be more than just warm words, it must be ambitious action too? And finally, will she confirm which ministers will be losing their jobs for the appointment of 2 new ones?
First Minister.
An election campaign, and indeed we've heard more of it today, hearing Anna Sarwar talk about the responsibility on all of us to focus on what we agree on, not what we disagree on. I actually agree with him and commended him during the election campaign for striking that tone. I think the problem is that so far there is nothing from Anna Sarwar to suggest that that has anything in substance and is any more than rhetoric. Because all of the challenges that he has rightly alluded to today are exactly the challenges that this agreement sets out concrete actions, investments, plans and policies to address, not in rhetoric, but in substance. And we have agreed to do that, notwithstanding the disagreements between us. So we are, both of us, being prepared to compromise, being prepared to cede some control and come together in order to do better for the country. And, you know, in the days after the election, and Anna Sarwar knows this, I invited Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater in to talk about how we could cooperate. I also invited Anna Sarwar in to talk about how the SNP and Labour may cooperate. The difference is that the Scottish Greens took that seriously, went away and thought about it and came back and tried to work towards an agreement. So I say to Anna Sarwar now, it's not too late to be part of that consensus. There is a strategic choice for the opposition parties in the face of this agreement. I think I'm fairly certain which choice the Conservatives will make. I think it is perhaps more of an open question which choice Labour will make, and I suspect it will define much of Anas Sarwar's leadership of his party, because the choice is coming with us to try to find the common ground, respecting our disagreements and working together to meet the challenges, or moving more and more to the margins of politics along with the Conservatives. So I make an open invitation to Anas Sarwar again today to work with us, to cooperate, to be part of that consensus building, because I agree with them, that's what the country needs. But it takes courage to do it, it takes boldness to do it, and it takes a willingness to do it in substance, not just in empty rhetoric.
Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The cooperation agreement includes a £500 million Just Transition Fund for the North East and Moray. Can the First Minister provide further detail on how the fund will support people seeking to move from the oil and gas sector to green jobs?
First Minister.
Well, the £500 million Just Transition deal is vital in making not just the transition from oil and gas to renewables, but doing that in a fair and just way. We will set out in the period ahead the detail of how that fund will operate and the objectives which it will support. We will be working with partners, communities and other stakeholders to take it forward. It is intended to accelerate the transition of the region, support the role of Aberdeen and the wider North East as a centre of excellence for the development of new technologies and the transition to a net zero economy. The scope, timing and design of the fund will be developed in consultation with stakeholders and set out to Parliament as soon as possible.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I'd like to press for clarity on oil and gas, please. Patrick Harvie has bragged that the Greens have changed significantly the First Minister's position on the future of our oil and gas sector and the tens of thousands of jobs it supports. Lorna Slater stated she wants to shut the industry down within the next 4 years. So does this government support new oil and gas exploration and production, or Lorna Slater's closure plans?
First Minister.
Well, the agreement sets out exactly what we agree on, and as far as my view is concerned around new exploration, I set that out in a letter to the Prime Minister, just as it is the case that new licences for exploration have to be assessed against the climate emergency. So too, in my view, should existing licences before production goes ahead. We face an inescapable climate emergency. We have to recognise that it is not any longer consistent with tackling that climate emergency simply to assume we can go on and on with unlimited extraction of fossil fuels. But we must support a fair and a just transition. I think the oil and gas sector recognises that. The responsibility on government is to make sure we are providing the support and the investment to do that. Parties like the Conservatives will no doubt go on burying their heads in the sand in the face of the climate emergency. We will not do that. We will provide the leadership to make sure that this country meets its targets on climate change, that it transitions to net zero by 2045, and that we take the jobs and the expertise, the skills and the infrastructure built up over decades in the oil and gas sector and use those to drive the alternatives that we need. Other parties, I hope, will be part of that, but all of us have an inescapable duty to meet the climate emergency head on.
James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I acknowledge the Scottish Government commitment to prioritising the COVID recovery. However, as you said earlier in your opening statement, it is right that the people of Scotland have a say in what that recovery looks like in the long term. Can you outline for the Chamber how this agreement between the SNP and the Greens strengthens the democratic mandate for an independence referendum to ensure that as we rebuild from the COVID pandemic, we also build that fairer and greener Scotland that we all want?
First Minister.
Well, first and foremost, we have a duty. I have a duty as First Minister to continue to lead the country through the ongoing COVID crisis. I'll make a statement here tomorrow on the latest COVID situation and the steps we need to continue to take collectively to tackle the increase in transmission. But as we come out of the acute crisis, as we recover our economy, our society, our whole way of life, we have big choices to take and to make about the kind of country we are recovering to. We're not alone in that regard. Countries across the world are asking themselves these questions. And I believe that the answers to those questions should be shaped and decided here in Scotland by our democratically elected government and parliament, not imposed upon us by a Westminster government that, as we see so powerfully on Brexit, is intent on taking us in a direction that the majority do not want to go in. You know, the question here is not whether we all in this parliament agree on the question of independence. Clearly we don't, and that is perfectly legitimate in a democracy. The question is, are we all prepared to agree in the basic principle of democracy, that election mandates should be honoured and that questions over the future of our country should not be taken by politicians, but by the people of our country? The arithmetic in this Parliament is there and it is clear. There is a mandate for an independence referendum that should be honoured, and I am determined that it will be honoured, and the people of Scotland will decide the future of this country.
Jackie Baillie.
In February 2021, the Greens supported Scottish Labour's demand for a minimum of £15 an hour for social care workers in the budget. Less than 2 weeks later, clearly nobbled by the SNP, the Greens abstained on the same demand. It appeared in the Green manifesto, but not in the SNP manifesto. And try as I might, I can find no reference to it in the SNP Green agreement. So can I ask the First Minister, when will social care workers get £15 an hour, or have the Greens sold out? Can I also ask if the Greens will be bound by collective responsibility in relation to planning applications, such as that submitted by Flamingo Land at Loch Lomond?
First Minister.
Jackie Baillie's been in this Parliament since its inception. She is very well aware of the constraints on ministers when it comes to planning applications, and I'm actually quite surprised that she has asked a question of that nature when she knows how ill-founded it is. But on the other question, can I say to Jackie Baillie, any member of this chamber will be able to find lots of examples of where the Greens and the SNP don't agree and haven't agreed in the past. But what we have done, and this is the whole point of what we are doing, we have come together to focus on where we do agree, but also crucially, we've come together to work together to find the ways of achieving the things we agree on. So on the question of pay for social care workers, yes, we want to achieve that. But the Greens, to their great credit, in my view, have decided to come into government to be part of working out through our budgets and through our decision-making how we deliver that, rather than simply standing on the sidelines, shouting for something to happen with no consideration at all of how to make it happen. It is the difference between achieving nothing in opposition and achieving lots by having the guts to go into government and take the decisions required.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Presiding officer, this is thin gruel for the Green Party. The SNP government have barely had to budge. Take education, something that in the last Parliament, the Greens worked with us to reform. Yet every single education policy in this agreement document was existing government policy before those negotiations began. The Greens haven't moved the dial at all. In fact, this deal takes us backwards on education. All opposition parties voted in 2018 to halt the national testing of primary ones. There was a parliamentary majority backed by teachers and by parents to that end, one which the SNP government chose to roundly ignore. The First Minister told us that testing would not lead to league tables, and yet there are now league tables in the national press. So will national testing of 4- and 5-year-olds finally be abolished, or have the Greens surrendered the parliamentary majority that existed in support of that abolition as well?
First Minister.
I think it's a bit rich, I have to say, from the leader, and my congratulations to Alex Cole-Hamilton on his election as leader. But the leader of a parliamentary group that doesn't even yet doesn't any longer qualify as a parliamentary group because it lost ground in the election, to criticise a party that increased its presence in this Parliament and is actually intent on trying to achieve change for the people that they represent. The Greens, over all of the years I've been in government have, through cooperation and constructive opposition, achieved more than the Liberal Democrats have. And they will achieve even more in government.
Sorry, members, there's a lot of conversations going on. I understand that we're all very pleased to be back in the chamber, but we can catch up later. So can we please focus on the business and make sure that we're hearing those who are speaking at any point in time? Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I say I'm absolutely delighted to be back in the chamber and enjoying it very much indeed so far. But the Greens, I'm sure, will achieve a great deal in government through collaboration, cooperation and being constructive around getting things done. And I say again to the opposition parties across this chamber, you know, the offer is there for all of us to try to come together and find the areas we can agree on. The question will be who is prepared to do that and who isn't. The Greens, to their credit, are, and it remains to be seen whether anybody else is willing to work in that constructive way.
Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The agreement between the Green Party and the Scottish Government is welcome, particularly at a time when others in the chamber seem to be shying away from working collaboratively to address with urgency the impacts of the climate emergency. Can the First Minister expand on how this agreement will bolster the Scottish Government's work to achieve our ambitious net zero targets?
First Minister.
Well, at a very basic level, this agreement will make sure that those of us who've been in government a long time are accepting and embracing fresh challenge, because we need fresh thinking and we need bolder ideas and action to meet the climate emergency. There is no escaping that. We've got to make sure that we're accelerating that transition, but as we do that, that we are harnessing and realising the massive economic benefits that are there to be won, that we haven't always been as good as we should have been at harnessing in the past. So I think this agreement, focusing on very specific areas, how we change the way in which we heat our homes, how we decarbonise our public transport system, how we make sure that we protect our natural environment through the specifics of this agreement, we can see how we will take forward those responsibilities. But in the very nature of a cooperation agreement that demands compromise from all of us, that demands consensus building, I hope and believe we will challenge each other to go further and faster, because that, I believe, is what is needed and wanted indeed by a majority of people across the country.
Liz Smith.
At the time of the recent Scottish election, the Scottish Greens said that we needed to move away from traditional economic policies and abandon the endless focus on economic growth. Business in Scotland, virtually every economic policy body in Scotland and the banking sector are all absolutely adamant that economic growth is vital to recovery from the pandemic. Indeed, that was a view that seemed to be expressed by the Finance Committee at this morning's Finance Committee. Can I ask on whose side is the First Minister when it comes to economic growth?
First Minister.
I believe in economic growth that is sustainable. The Greens and the Greens and the SNP have a difference of opinion, which is set out openly in the agreement, about the role of GDP as a metric. In that, I believe it is an appropriate metric, but not the only one we should rely on. So I believe we should widen our measurements of economic success. I believe that for a long time, which is why this government is one of the founding governments of the Wellbeing Alliance, which now involves a growing number of governments across the world, saying that the health and the happiness and the well-being of a population should also matter in our judgments of economic success, that it shouldn't simply be GDP. And it's at the heart of this agreement that is an agreement to develop those metrics of how we measure our success as an economy, as a society. I think more and more people across Scotland, more and more people and governments across the world are recognising that. It doesn't surprise me, but it does disappoint me that the Conservatives continue to sit outside of that. Hopefully that's something we might see change over the course of this Parliament.
Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is an historic agreement between the Scottish Greens and the Scottish Government, a new model of politics responding to the code red for humanity on the climate while building a fair recovery from COVID. The agreement has bold and far-reaching programme that will accelerate a just transition, doubling the size of the wind industry that was previously butchered by the Tory party at Westminster, a £1.8 billion investment in energy efficiency, renewable heat, and £500 million just transition fund for the North East. Can I ask the First Minister, does she agree that this programme will help Scotland grasp the economic opportunities of the just transition, creating new, fair jobs while tackling the climate emergency?
First Minister.
Yes, I do. And that actually is one of the biggest challenges we face. I hope, notwithstanding impressions to the contrary from some today, I hope that there is genuinely a unanimous agreement across this chamber that tackling the climate emergency with urgency and determination is not an option. I do hope genuinely we all agree on that. But one of the big questions is how we do that. And do we achieve it in a way that is just and fair and seizes and realises those massive economic opportunities? If I'm being candid, and we've had exchanges in the chamber on many occasions in the past about this, we've not been as successful at that as we should have been in the past. So through, and Lorna Slater, subject to parliamentary approval later on, will have a key role to play in this, driving a new green industrial strategy so that we do meet our obligations in terms of reducing emissions, but we are doing it in a way that creates new jobs and new industries of the future. There's a big challenge here in climate change, but there's a massive opportunity as well. And I think this agreement will help us seize that. And for that reason, I think all of us and people right across the country should genuinely be enthused, inspired and excited by it.
Alistair Allen.
Presiding Officer, it has been more than a decade since national park designation for the Isle of Harris had to be abandoned, despite more than 70% of residents backing the move in a plebiscite, which had a higher than 70% turnout. There was limited support from the local authority, and that contributed to the bid being rejected. The shared policy programme commits to at least one new national park being designated by the end of this parliamentary session. So can the First Minister say more about the process by which a new national park will be chosen?
First Minister.
I thank Alistair Allen for that question. The process will follow the National Parks Scotland Act 2000. That includes a detailed process of consultation with communities, local authorities and other stakeholders. The criteria for designation include that an area is of outstanding national importance because of its natural heritage, or a combination of its natural and cultural heritage, and has a distinctive character and coherent identity. In the agreement, we make clear that we believe national parks should be designated only in response to local community demand. So we do encourage community stakeholders and local government to come forward now with proposals.
Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If I can just quote from the coalition agreement, it says the current plan is to fully dual the A96 route between Inverness and Aberdeen. It then goes on to talk about having a transparent, evidence-based review to include a climate compatibility assessment. So can the First Minister say, will the A96 be fully dualled or not?
First Minister.
Well, I think Graham Simpson should probably quote more fully from the agreement. So let me do that as well. Let's focus on what it agrees in terms of enhancements to the A96, dualling from Inverness to Nairn, bypasses in Nairn, Keith, Elgin and Inverurie, road safety improvements, for example, between Fochabers and Huntly and Inverurie to Aberdeen, the development of an A96 electric highway, and of course enhanced public transport improvements in North East Scotland. So a range of improvements, including looking at a rail link between Dice and Ellen, further north to Peterhead and Fraserburgh, reviewing the A96 corridor with a view to implementing bus priority measures. And yes, it does say that the current plan is for full dualling. But as with any major road development, environmental assessments and impact assessments have to be carried out, because in this period of having to address the climate emergency, no politician with any credibility would suggest that we don't assess all of our policies against the climate imperative. So we set out clearly our priorities and the process we will take to making sure that people across the North East have the transport links that they need in order for the economy to thrive.
Jim Fairley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For the majority of the members in this duly elected chamber, the most important step we can take to empower the Parliament and the people of Scotland is to be able to make the changes we needed is to be an independent country. With Westminster's continuing refusal to recognise the clear democratic mandate delivered by the people of this country when we were elected to the Parliament in May, where does the First Minister think this agreement leaves us constitutionally? And what are the options available as we seek to provide the people of Scotland with the ability to determine our own future?
First Minister.
There's a basic question of democracy here. You know, we have disagreements in this chamber about what future Scotland should choose. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the essence of democracy. I believe fervently, and I have done so for all of my adult life, that Scotland should become an independent country, like all the 200 independent countries across the world, so that we can work in partnership with other countries, but have the ability to determine and shape our own future. People are entitled to disagree and say that Scotland is better remaining within the Westminster Union. But the people who should decide that question are not us as politicians. It's the population of Scotland that should decide that question. And those on the Conservative benches are saying, well, that happened in 2014. But since 2014, Scotland has been ripped out of the European Union against our will. People across Scotland are struggling to get basic food supplies in supermarkets right now because of a Tory-imposed Brexit. And of course, this government fought the election on a commitment to give the people of Scotland a choice in a referendum, and won with historic vote shares and many other record-breaking results along the way. So let's have that rigorous debate about the future of Scotland, but let us accept that central tenet of democracy, that it is the people of Scotland and only the people of Scotland who should get to decide.
Neil Bibby.
On the very same day this deal was announced, ScotRail unveiled a consultation on timetable changes that would cut 300 rail services. The SNP Transport Minister seems to accept these cuts. One wonders if the Green Ministers do too. Given what the First Minister said on investing in public transport and tackling the climate emergency, will she be stopping these cuts to rail services? And if not, how can they possibly justify record ministerial salaries, more ministerial cars and bicycles when making cuts to Scotland's rail services for everybody else?
First Minister.
Commitments in this agreement are about investing in our rail services, bringing our rail services back into public ownership, nationalising ScotRail, making sure that there are services that people in every part of our country can rely on, but also making sure that we have affordable fares for people to travel and that we cut emissions in our rail network as well. Are there difficult decisions to be made along the way in all of this? Of course, but there's a determination to come together to make sure we are taking those decisions so that our transport network is capable and fit for the purpose of transporting people across the country for work and for leisure, but also meets our imperative on the climate emergency. Again, I welcome the input, I welcome the engagement from members across this chamber. The question is whether those on the Labour benches are prepared to work on that basis. I certainly hope that they take up the invitation.
Marie McNair.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome this agreement between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party. I believe this is a fundamental moment in the continued progression of devolution in Scotland that will lead us to the normal status of independence. Could the First Minister outline the benefits that this agreement will bring to local authorities across Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, I think the agreement has very many elements that are positive for local government and democracy. So, for example, work to increase voter registration and participation, particularly in underrepresented groups. The commitment to undertake an independent review of the Scottish Welfare Fund, important to many families and individuals across the country. There's a variety of policies in the shared programme that will see us work very collaboratively with COSLA. So, for example, commitments in community wealth building, planning, active travel, work on education reform, the establishment of a national care service. All of these have an impact on local authorities, so engagement and joint work on these issues are important. And of course, we'll be seeking a strategic discussion with COSLA's leadership on the agreement and, of course, the upcoming programme for government. We work collaboratively with COSLA, and this agreement will enhance the various measures where we can help local authorities deliver their services for people across the country.
Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, there's a concern that this agreement ignores rural communities, and I'd previously been delighted when the First Minister visited my constituency during the election campaign, shared my pledge to reopen Inch Community Hospital. The First Minister actually went further, saying we are prepared as a government, if re-elected, to make funding available to the Health Board, not just to reopen it, but to do work to give it a long-term sustainable future. Now, I did write to the First Minister over 2 weeks ago on this, but have yet to receive a reply. So can the First Minister now confirm to the Inch community that her commitment is not at jeopardy from her Green Agreement and set out the timescale for the delivery of her promise?
First Minister.
Well, can I say I thoroughly enjoyed my visit to Inch during the election. I stand by the commitments that we made around Inch Community Hospital. Next week, this time next week, when I set out the programme for government, as part of that, we will set out our ambitions for capital investment across the health service estate as we take the decisions to ensure that it is fit for purpose. And I am very sure that our Green colleagues will be as enthusiastic about seeing community health facilities as well as the elective treatment centres and more specialist services developed over the period ahead. And I look forward to saying more about all of these things next week in the programme for government.
Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is a pressing need for action on climate change, and a growing number of Scots believe independence will unlock the powers necessary to ensure a just transition to a greener society. How will this cooperation deal further our collective fight, promote sustainable economic change and advance Scotland's journey towards independence?
First Minister.
Well, within the devolved context, of course, this agreement contains a number of commitments that will help deliver a just transition to net zero. I've already touched on some of them. The transition deal for the North East and Moray, for example, the national strategy for economic transformation is vital in terms of building the economy we need for the future. The Green Industrial Strategy, which I've spoken about, just transition plans for industries and sectors and regions across the country to help our supply chains create high quality jobs. So within this agreement, within our devolved powers, the plans are ambitious and wide reaching. But it is a fact that for us to meet our full potential, the full range of powers over tax, over social security, to build that greener, fairer Scotland are necessary. So ensuring that the mandate to give people a choice on independence in this Parliament is honoured is a key part of making sure that we meet the challenges that lie ahead.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The additional 2 ministers and 2 additional special advisors will cost Scotland's taxpayers £1 million. In 2007, the SNP promised the Scottish people, in their manifesto, a smaller, better focused ministerial team. So may I ask the First Minister, how does she feel? Is she proud of leading the largest and most bloated government in the history of devolution?
First Minister.
Well, what I can say with absolute certainty is every single Scottish Government minister is fully occupied and working hard every single day to deliver on the commitments and policies of this government. I do believe Scotland is over-governed. I do believe there is some, to use Stephen Kerr's word, bloating in the governance of Scotland. Some people call it the Scotland Office, but perhaps Stephen Kerr has another name for it. So let's have more streamlined government. Let's abolish the Scotland Office through Scotland becoming independent. And while we're at it, perhaps the House of Lords could be dispensed with as well, so that all of the politicians we have working for us are fully occupied and doing real jobs, delivering day in and day out for the Scottish people.
Emma Harper.
I welcome the agreement between the SNP and the Scottish Green Party. And in addition to the green transport projects, such as the potential for Dumfries to Stranraer or Stranraer to Cairnryan rail links, can the First Minister give an assurance that the cooperation agreement will not prevent the long-standing lobbying efforts to ensure improvements and upgrades on the A75 and A77, particularly on safety aspects of the roads when the STPR2 is finally published?
First Minister.
I want to thank Emma Harper for that question. We have, of course, already published the South West Scotland Transport Study that emphasised the importance of a connected, safe, resilient and high-quality strategic transport network for those travelling in South West Scotland. The recommendations for targeted road improvements to the A75 and A77 are now, of course, subject to more detailed appraisal as part of the STPR2 process, and that is the overall process through which we have agreed to direct future transport infrastructure investment.
Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour has been calling for an immediate moratorium on new incinerators alongside a policy review. The Scottish Green website has a quote from Mark Wiskell warning that Scotland is sleepwalking into an incineration nightmare. and I sincerely hope it didn't harm his ministerial chances. In the spirit of working collaboratively with all parties and listening to our communities that are under threat right now, will the First Minister work with Scottish Labour to introduce an urgent moratorium on new large-scale incinerators? And in case I missed the First Minister getting off the fence, can she clarify whether the SNP Green government that she leads now supports the Stop Campbell campaign, yes or no?
First Minister.
Well, on the first question, as I'm sure Monica Lennon knows, we have committed to a process of review to consider the role of incineration in how we deal with waste, and I understand the process of that review will be set out in the next couple of weeks, so imminently, and I'm sure Monica Lennon will have an input into that. The difference between being in government and opposition is you have to deal in detail with issues. I do think there are big issues over whether, and big questions over whether we should continue with new exploration in the North Sea, and that would include the Campbell development. That's why I think there should be a process. Licences are granted there, but there should be a process before production agreement approval is given. There should be a process of checking that against the climate emergency. I think that's the right way to go, because I don't think we should carry on with business as usual in terms of energy any more than we can right across our society. And I'm prepared to challenge my long-held views to make sure we are doing the right things, and I would encourage everybody to do likewise.
And Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is a lot to look forward to in this new agreement, particularly in terms of addressing the climate emergency that we all face and securing a more sustainable future for Scotland. Although I do think it is understandable that many out with the Central Belt or city centres are eagerly waiting to hear how a greater focus on active travel and public transport can benefit them. So as a region which is currently widely dependent on car travel, can the Highlands and Islands expect to see real improvement in rail infrastructure, perhaps including a doubling of the Highland Main Line and the Inverness to Aberdeen line, and improvements to the Far North and West Highland lines as a result of this deal?
First Minister.
Well, yeah, I think that is a fair question, and I think the answer to that has to be yes. We have to develop public transport and active travel options across the Highlands and Islands. I was going to say as much as in the rest of the country, but more so given the geographic challenges and the over-reliance for understandable reasons on car use. As members will be aware, rail improvements are being considered as part of the S2 PR2 process, and the Rail Decarbonisation Action Plan, which was published last year, is aligned to this. So, for example, the action plan commits to developing potential options to serve the West Highland line by hydrogen or battery trains, as well as considering partial or full electrification of the Highland Main Line. These are longer-term projects that will contribute to our commitment to decarbonise passenger services by 2035. But at the core of this question is the inescapable fact that if we are to meet the targets around reducing reliance on car use for all of the country, but some parts of our country in particular, that absolutely depends on developing the alternatives. And there's an absolute seriousness of intent around that across the Highlands and Islands.
Thank you. That concludes the First Minister's statement on the agreement with the Scottish Green Party. And I'll just take this opportunity to remind members that social distancing measures are in place across the Chamber and the Holyrood campus. And please take care to observe these measures, including when entering and exiting the Chamber. And please only use the aisles and walkways to access your seat and when moving around the Chamber. The next item of business is a debate on motion 987 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on appointment of junior Scottish ministers. I shall invite the First Minister to move the motion. I then intend to invite each party to make a short contribution. I call on the First Minister to speak to and move the motion.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. It gives me great pleasure to rise to move and support the motion in my name that Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater be appointed as Scottish Junior Ministers. My statement earlier set out the reasons for and the detail of the cooperation agreement struck between the Scottish Government and Scottish Greens. These appointments will deliver a key element of that agreement. And by approving these appointments today, Parliament will make some history, not just in Scottish politics, but across the UK as a whole. This will be the first time that Green politicians have entered national government in any part of these islands. Our cooperation agreement commits us to a raft of commitments necessary to steer Scotland through the challenges we face: action to support tenants and tackle poverty, plans to reform public services, investments to accelerate our transition to net zero and create green jobs, and so much more besides. These ministers, appointed from the ranks of the Greens, will now share the responsibility, but also the great privilege of delivering on this bold, ambitious programme. Patrick Harvie will take on the role of Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, Active Travel and Tenants' Rights. Patrick has, of course, been an MSP representing the Glasgow region since 2003. During his time in politics, Patrick has served as the convener of the Transport, Infrastructure and Climate Change Committee, and he is, I believe, the longest-serving party leader in the Scottish Parliament. He's also a passionate and effective campaigner for the causes he believes in. I personally worked closely with Patrick during the 2014 referendum, and that experience makes me genuinely enthusiastic about the opportunity to work with him again, this time in the Scottish Government. His wide-ranging brief, including active travel, energy efficiency and tenants' rights, gives Patrick the task of leading and implementing, together with his ministerial colleagues, some of the most significant transformations that we need to make to tackle the climate emergency. Lorna Slater will become Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity. Amongst her responsibilities, Lorna will be tasked with driving a green industrial strategy, helping people acquire the skills they need to benefit from the transition to net zero, creating a more circular economy and working to protect our natural environment. Lorna was born and brought up in Canada, and after earning a master's degree in engineering, moved here to Scotland in 2000. Since then, she's been working as an engineer and then a project manager in the renewable sector, which included working on the world's biggest tidal turbine. As such, although she may be relatively new to Parliament, Lorna brings formidable professional experience. She's not only been working in one of the key industries powering our greener future, but her project management experience will also serve her in good stead in ministerial office. I have complete confidence that both new ministers will make an excellent contribution to the Scottish Government. Presiding Officer, Patrick, Lorna, myself and the rest of the Scottish ministerial team are ready to get on with delivering our ambitious commitments and building a fairer, greener Scotland. I now therefore formally and with great pleasure ask Parliament to support the appointments of Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater as Scottish Junior Ministers, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you. I now call Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When this deal was announced, it confirmed that the Greens had finally given up any pretence of being an opposition party. For years, they've propped up the SNP, backing John Swinney whenever he failed miserably, rubber-stamping budget deals in exchange for a car park tax, and not much else. Just as we warned at the time, if you vote Green, you really get SNP yellow. But instead of fronting this up for what it is, a coalition, the Greens wanted to have their cake and eat it. Somehow they were still trying to pretend that they're in opposition while they were in government. When Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater accepted ministerial positions in the government, they wanted to keep asking that same government questions at FNQs. They wanted to have opposition debating time so they could do the government's bidding for them. That's why I'm pleased, Presiding Officer, that like those of us on these benches, you saw through that and have ruled accordingly. Yeah. Of course, all of this was an effort by the Greens to rig the Scottish Parliament by pretending this coalition is something else, even though their own constitution defines it as exactly that. And what a coalition of chaos this will be. And that is exactly why the Scottish Conservatives will be voting against the Green members becoming ministers today. Because the Greens are a serious threat to Scotland's economic recovery. At First Minister's question time, right after the election, we said the SNP had to reset its relationship with the business community. Now, I know the First Minister's on her phone just now. I don't know if it's to business leaders or if she really speaks to business much at all at the moment, but I can assure her that is not the reset that businesses in Scotland wanted. In fact, it is the exact opposite. The SNP has brought extremists into government in the middle of an economic crisis. Well, the SNP don't want to hear this, but the Greens are extreme, and they've made it clear themselves. Patrick Harvie said, and I quote, "Successive UK and Scottish governments have shared an ideological belief in the pursuit of endless economic growth." Lorna Slater has rallied against, and I quote, endless economic growth, and they attacked it in their manifesto. Well, for once, I hand it to the Greens. They have nailed it. My party has pursued endless economic growth, and we continue to do so unashamedly. We pursued more jobs, more businesses, and I can't quite believe it. The Greens have rumbled us. We do want hard-working people to have more money in their pockets. I just don't understand why Nicola Sturgeon and her government don't. We pursue endless economic growth because it provides extra funding for our schools, for our hospitals, for our public services. And let's look at what the Greens really mean when they criticise endless economic growth. They want our economy to go backwards. That means businesses shutting down and people out of work. At the heart of her government, Nicola Sturgeon has introduced an anti-jobs, anti-business ideology, with people who hold the most extreme economic views of any Scottish Government minister since devolution. And if SNP members think that's a laughing matter, shame on you. Lorna Slater wants Scotland to have a totally different tax structure. And from the recent SNP Green budget deals, we know that means tax rises. She warned the oil and gas industry, which supports 100,000 jobs, to transition or die. Transition or die. She has said it's not possible to run out of money. In the middle of an economic crisis, Nicola Sturgeon has made her an economic minister. And these aren't just slips of the tongue. The Green Manifesto have proposals to stop people selling their homes unless they could pay for costly refurbishments, stop petrol and diesel car sales in just a few years, stop building all new roads. And any SNP member listening to the First Minister trying to dodge questions about the future of the A75, the A77, the A9 and the A96 will be burying their head in their hands. These are not serious proposals in the Green Manifesto. They're a joke. But now, thanks to Nicola Sturgeon, they are government policies. And she can try and distance herself from these outrageous positions, but she's brought them into her government. She said earlier this coalition was a leap of faith. But these appointments are reckless in the extreme, and the Scottish Conservatives strongly oppose them, and we will not vote for them today.
I now call on Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to welcome Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater to their new roles, but I fear that they will very quickly realise that the SNP's rhetoric does not match reality. I think they'll also very quickly realise that the divider-in-chief can only act the great unifier for so long. And I think they'll also come to realise that cooperation to Nicola Sturgeon means rolling over and doing what you're told. In terms of ideas for government, we did want the government to do £15 an hour for care workers. They said no. We did want them to double the Scottish child payment. They said no. Although when we asked the SNP to be more ambitious with the job creation scheme, we didn't mean finding jobs for their pals in Parliament. That wasn't quite the green shoots of recovery the people of Scotland were looking for. Frankly, this is not a new development or a new period in the governance of our great country. This is merely the final confirmation of the same coalition of cuts between the SNP and the Greens that has hammered Scotland's public services for years. And while I appreciate Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater's success in achieving for themselves some of the longest job titles in 21st century politics, serious questions need to be asked about why these roles could not be performed under the previous ministerial structure. They should be replacing existing ministers, not adding to the ministerial pay bill. But the elevation of Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvie to ministers comes with a substantial price tag for the Scottish taxpayer. There are now 8 more ministers in government than when Labour left office, and the ministerial wage bill is now set to exceed £1 million a year. £1 million a year for the first time since devolution, with over £2 million now set to be spent on maintaining the government and the ranks of special advisers that it employs, not to mention all those hundreds of press officers too. Now more press officers in Scotland than perhaps journalists themselves. The people of Scotland can be forgiven for feeling that their government is out of touch and short-changing them. Ignored by the government as local libraries, swimming pools and museums across Scotland closed their doors due to cuts signed off by this very government. No more can Patrick Harvie vote for cuts in this Parliament to local budgets and then stand outside the very libraries his cuts helped implement and protest against them. Presiding Officer, we are now just a couple of months away from COP26, when the eyes of the world will be on Glasgow. But already some of the most prominent climate activists have expressed their pessimism about what the summit will achieve and have cast doubt on this government's pretensions to be a leader in the fight against the climate crisis. I want COP26 to be a turning point for Scotland and the rest of the world. Future generations need it to be. The First Minister is shouting from the sidelines. I don't think 2 Green MSPs are going to quite be the great change the global community is looking for. That's why I want us to come out of COP26 with a truly historic Glasgow Agreement. The moment that the world turned their warm words into meaningful action to confront the climate crisis. That's, yes, the Scottish Government. It's also the UK Government. But frankly, it's also global governments turning their words into actual action so we can confront the climate emergency. We keep being told we have less than 10 years to confront it. Let's make that our national mission and priority. But when the leaders of the world descend on Glasgow, a city represented by me, Nicola Sturgeon and Patrick Harvie, they'll be entering a city in the grip of a dangerous and spiralling waste crisis, where cleansing workers are shamefully compared to the far right by an out-of-touch city leader. You're right, First Minister, that is ridiculous. Instead, I want them to see a country focused on the urgent issues at hand, not fighting over the Constitution. It is shameful, and she should address that directly with the leader of Glasgow City Council. These appointments today are more about how the government and Nicola Sturgeon looks than actually what it delivers for the people of Scotland. After 15 years, the people of Scotland deserve better.
I now call on Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When Robin Harper became Scotland and the UK's first elected Green parliamentarian in 1999, he reflected on how at the turn of the last century, the politics of change were represented by the colour red, and that the colour of the 21st century must be green. This afternoon, we'll take our first place in government, the first Greens anywhere in the UK to do so. We sometimes overuse the word historic in politics, but this is a genuinely historic moment. A new party, a new movement, a new politics is entering government. That's happened fewer than half a dozen times in the last century. Patrick Harvie will be, to the best of my knowledge, the First Minister for Tenants, who was himself evicted by an unscrupulous landlord. In fact, I think he's the First Minister to have tenants in their job title. And he'll be responsible for delivering the most ambitious tenants' rights agenda seen anywhere on these islands for decades. Patrick's been integral to the development of the Scottish Greens into a party capable of taking this step today. Having been taken along to ecology party meetings as a kid by his mum Rose, to joining a Scottish Green party that had about 300 members as an adult, to the Rainbow Parliament of 2003, the long decade of being just one of 2 Green MSPs, and the remarkable progress that we've made in more recent years. Just days after the IPCC issued their Code Red for humanity, the need for radical transformation of our economic and social systems could not be clearer. I know that Patrick will take that fierce sense of urgency with him into government and apply it across all of his portfolio responsibilities. Having known him as long as I have, though, I feel I owe Patrick's new government colleagues a word of warning. If you didn't know much about obscure 1970s science fiction before now, please be ready for that to change. And I'm not just talking about Doctor Who. We should probably swat up on that. With Patrick, at least, a growing Netflix watch list is the most that you need to prepare for. Lorna Slater's new colleagues, though, will sooner or later end up on the trapeze. It's hard to think of someone more qualified to take on the role of Minister for Green Skills and Industrial Strategy than Lorna, a renewables engineer who was, until just a few weeks ago, a key member of the team who delivered the world's most powerful tidal turbine here in Scotland. Lorna Slater brings real industry experience and expertise into government. She knows exactly what is required to deliver a just transition, because that is exactly what she was doing until she was elected to this place. I know personally just how committed Lorna is to getting the job done. For years, we've worked together to develop our party, including as conveners of its operations committee, one of those truly sought after positions where, as you know, Presiding Officer, you get all of the blame but none of the credit. Our recent electoral success, and particularly the election of a Green group where the majority of members are women, is in no small part down to Lorna's incredible project management skills, her patience and her stubborn determination. I should say briefly, Presiding Officer, that It's quite extraordinary to see the Tories come to this chamber today to accuse others of extremism. Douglas Ross has now had more than a week to apologise for his use of a homophobic dog whistle in response to our announcing this cooperation agreement. But yet again today, he has failed to do so. But the real hypocrisy is in the accusation that he levelled at the First Minister. Only 2 members of this Parliament have ever allowed an extremist party, a homophobic and a misogynistic party, to hold sway over a government. And they're sitting on the Conservatives' front bench today. Douglas Ross and Stephen Kerr were enthusiastic supporters of their party's cosy relationship with the DUP. So those of us who are committed to working together in the interests of people and planet will be taking no lessons from the extremist enablers on the Tory benches. Presiding Officer, this is a moment 48 years in the making for the Greens. We take this step because of the steps taken before us by Robin Harper, by Rose Harvey and by so many others. I'm so very excited to see what Patrick Harvey, Lorna Slater and their colleagues across the government achieve together over the coming years. I know they will serve the people of Scotland with passion and integrity, and I'll be proud to vote for Patrick and Lorna's appointment today.
I now call on Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by expressing some dismay? I mean, the First Minister regaled the chamber with talk of a new kind of politics. She then went on to wholly ignore my question about national testing and embarked on an infantile attack on my party. All hail the new politics, same as the old politics. As a Liberal Democrat, I will always look for and appreciate consensus in our politics. As such, I congratulate these 2 parties for having found such common ground, as indeed I congratulate Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater on their elevation, but I cannot support either the deal that they have arrived at or their appointment as Green Ministers, because my party just do not share that ground. The First Minister has attempted to emulate the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, who brought Greens into government in early 2020. She has sought to mirror that coalition with the appointment of the co-leaders of the Scottish Greens to ministerial office. However, theirs is a pale imitation of the deal hatched on the other side of the world, and thin gruel for a Green Party that has until now characterised itself as radical. The New Zealand deal was forged under the imperative of the climate crisis. It was significantly signed practically amidst the very smoke of the bushfires which had devastated their Australian neighbours. And Ardern wanted to demonstrate to the world that her government was taking this global threat seriously. And as such, the climate emergency formed the centrepiece of that deal. Whilst that imperative exists for Scottish ministers in equal measure, there is no such centrepiece to this. Presiding Officer, it will almost be inexplicable to the majority of Green voters who, according to a poll in April, support Scotland's retained place in the United Kingdom, that the central mission of this deal is a second independence referendum. This partnership exists first and foremost to ask Westminster for another referendum, and then to use its likely refusal to drive yet more grievance at the expense of all other public policy. It's not a deal with the climate in mind. After years of missed emissions targets, you would think that the Scottish Green Party might have driven a harder bargain. They have not. Ardern's power-sharing agreement went beyond climate and looked to social justice as well, but where her partnership stretched for new and radical frontiers in social policy, the Scottish deal does not. The New Zealand coalition immediately embarked on a brave new policy of testing pills at festivals to keep drug users safe. Yet the Nationalist Coalition agreement agreed today here is entirely silent on Scotland's drug death catastrophe. And far from being radical or extreme, there is very little to this deal at all. Now, I have mentioned national testing, but on issues like wider education reform, the abolition of the council tax, the decarbonisation of our homes, matters where you would expect Green MSPs to want to have a say from the backbenches, there is very little substance, and they will not seek to trouble the SNP or subject it to effective scrutiny. Presiding Officer, there is even a clause in the agreement which demands that the Greens offer, and I quote, no surprises to their partners. I can almost hear the groans across the chamber, because from here on in, when it comes to contributions from Green backbenchers, we will be subjected to choreographed softball questions and speeches scripted by government spies. For there is no question that the Green Party have surrendered entirely and for the life of this Parliament their opposition status. Nicola Sturgeon must be rubbing her hands at having got such a cheap deal. When I think of the Greens in Scotland, I remember the party of Robin Harper, a movement focused on reform and dedicated to challenging the old order of things. Robin never swapped environmentalism for nationalism because he supported Scotland's place in the United Kingdom. I really don't know what's happened to that radical zeal or that internationalist focus. By putting nationalism ahead of the climate emergency, Patrick Harvey and co have revealed their true colours. Those colours look far more like the acid yellow of the party of government than the proud emerald of the global green movement. That is why the Liberal Democrats will oppose this motion tonight.
Thank you. The question is that motion 987 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on appointment of junior Scottish ministers be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system. Thank you. The question is that motion 987 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on appointment of junior Scottish ministers be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is now closed. The result of the vote on motion 987 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon is yes 69, no 56. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. There will now be a short pause before the next item of business.